Check, 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 check. 1, 2.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Perry World House and our program for the day, Cities in a New Era, Shifting Geopolitical Realities and Diplomatic Strategies. We will be starting our program shortly. If I could ask everybody to find a seat closest to the front and check your cell phones to make sure that they're turned off, it would be appreciated. Thank you. Bye.
Let me just make sure it went on. I'm sorry. Yeah, it's green. And you can clip that on your jacket.
Can I do? Yeah, this side. Perfect. Good. Okay. Wait, let me get this out of your way. Let me get myself out of.
You know this? To come here this time, I needed to get another type of visa.
Didn't you move to Chicago? Are you in Chicago?
I was
1, 2, 1, 2. So I just put it anywhere.
You're based out of here? Oh, you're
Sorry?
a fellow here. Oh, got it.
Like here?
arrived last 3 days ago.
Okay.
So I needed to get a different kind of visa. I had a tourist visa. I needed to get a scholar. So I did it. But today I went to register myself here at the International Relations Department, and it happens that the guy who had the passport.
You want it all on stage? Okay. It's all props.
Miami's airport didn't stamp my passport.
That is
So there's-
serious, my
there's
friend.
no actual proof
That's
that I am here.
that's really bad. That is. He could get arrested. I mean, you guys could
Can I?
support him.
Yeah, this is.
Yeah, that's a very serious.
Me or the passport guy?
You having a passport that wasn't stamped.
It's just hot right now. So we make sure you
He
know.
did it. It was,
They don't stamp people all the time.
yeah.
Really?
And then I realized that this happens in Miami very frequently. They just
Yeah,
don't
you show
stamp
them
the
another.
passport.
Yeah. Like you still like get your visa processed and everything, but they don't do like.
I mean, the guy reviewed my
That seems
passport. I mean, the guy
I
checked my
know.
passport, my
Unusual.
forms, and everything. I didn't realize he didn't stamp it. But I mean, that's his job, not mine.
Then you go here. That's
They
because I may take this off.
They stamped it, but they had the year 1 year wrong on the stamp that day.
really?
So
Oh.
all of us came in and it looked like we had come in a year earlier. Yeah, and we had to go through a whole thing of like
Oh
swearing
gosh.
to
Wow.
show that we hadn't been there illegally for a year.
Wow.
And I was studying, so they wouldn't give me my transcript or anything until I
But
rectified my visa.
when I realized I didn't have the stamp, I started panicking. So and I asked the guy at the ISSS, and he was like, "No, this happens all the time."
Oh,
Actually,
okay.
all the time, but we want to make sure you're
Okay,
here.
so Mark-
Then we'll come and get you. All right, now we're going to go in order.
Just wait, I stand until you tell us to sit, or do you want me to sit?
You go right ahead.
And I sit. Okay. Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. I think the topic is really cool. It's really.
20 questions.
To follow you.
Go at it.
How long do you think
Thank
the
you.
intervention should be? Here, 5.
But then you'll follow up.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Perry World House, the University of Pennsylvania's provost-level hub for global engagement. Our mission focuses on tackling the world's most pressing challenges by bringing together policymakers and academics from around the world. My name is Michael Horowitz, and I'm the interim director of Perry World House and a political science professor. And we're really excited today to be hosting this keynote conversation on cities in a new era, shifting geopolitical realities and diplomatic strategies. Not only is this an incredibly important topic, we're also very fortunate to have an incredible speakers. They've been at the forefront of this evolution of urbanization, city diplomacy, city networks, and more. This event also marks the formal launch of a much larger project known as the Great Powers and Urbanization Project, or GPUP, I guess. Perry World House is leading on this and partnering with a number of important and impressive organizations from around the world, including the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the University of Melbourne's Connected Cities Lab, the Argentine Council of International Relations, and the Barcelona Center for International Affairs, which has expressed interest in joining. Jocelyn, I don't even know what that means. Tomorrow, Perry World House will host a conference on cities, geopolitics, and international legal order, followed by convenings at each of these partner institutions. These will culminate in a series of policy memos, podcasts, and other outputs that we hope will shed some light on this new era of cities and geopolitics. In this truly interdisciplinary endeavor, with input from policymakers and academic researchers from around the world, is exactly the kind of thing that Perry World House was designed to support and to promote. And so thank you all in the audience for being here today, and special thanks to our panelists today, Penny Abeywardena, the Commissioner of International Affairs for the City of New York, Henri-Paul Normandin, Director of International Relations for the City of Montreal, and Mauricio Rodas, the immediate past mayor of Quito, Ecuador, who we are very grateful to have with us this year as a visiting fellow at Perry World House. I'd also like to thank Bill Burke-White, the inaugural director of Perry World House. He told me not to mention him, but he is on sabbatical this year and generally trying to hide. But in many ways, this gathering was inspired by him from day one, and he's actually writing a book on many similar themes. And I'm now happy to turn this over to Ian Klaus, one of Perry World House's former visiting fellows and a non-resident fellow with the Chicago Council, who will be leading this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael, and good evening. It's wonderful to be back. I know a collaborator isn't an official title, though maybe it is for millennials, but I feel like maybe I can be a collaborator with PWH ongoing. And thank you all for joining us this evening, and some of our friends, I think, from Buenos Aires who are joining us electronically as well. The title, as Michael said, is Cities in a New Era. Cities have been around for millennia, of course, as have geopolitics, and competitive rivalry between empires and cities and states. It does beg the question, what's new? We couldn't title this session Cities in the Same Era, or the same cities in the same era. Everything is the same because, of course, we know that's not true. If you've been attending PWH events for the past year, if you've been reading academic papers, if you've been following multilateral negotiations, if you've been reading the National Geographic while you're in an airport newsstand, you know that cities are a very hot topic. There are some arguments behind this, I think. The first is that cities are qualitatively different today, many of them, than their predecessors. And the second is that cities are engaging in a qualitatively different way on the global stage. The first argument has been put forth by people like Saskia Sassen, Gregory Clark. The second argument about cities as global actors has been put forth by people like Michaela Acuto, Jeannie Birch, a colleague who joins us here tonight, and Simon Curtis, among many others. We're here in part to test those two ideas, as well as a third. And the third is that perhaps beginning in 2016, but probably a couple years before that, there's been something of a seismic shift in the geopolitical situation. And we could debate the exact terms, but it seems that the norms of international society and some of the traditional alliances and support from multilateral organizations, as well as competition between great powers, has changed rather dramatically in the past 5 years, if not certainly in the past 3. That's the third idea we're here to test out tonight. And to do so, I'm joined on stage, as Michael said, with people who are seeing this from the front line in Quito, from the front line in Montreal, and from the front line in New York City. And so to my right is Mauricio Rodas, the former mayor of Quito, who's now in residence here at PWH, and Penny Abeywardena. Abeywardena.
Good try, though.
My apologies.
It's all right.
Who is the Commissioner of International Affairs in New York City. And of course, Henri-Paul Normandin. Okay.
Close enough.
See, he wasn't even close
The
to
Director of
mine, so that was
International
good,
Relations for the City of Montreal. I should also be doing that in French, I know. And so I think I would actually like to start, if I can, with you, Mauricio. And this is to take something of a little bit of revenge, which is, as some people in this room had the good fortune of doing in terms of negotiating the new urban agenda in 2016 and 2015, you hosted that event in Quito, of course, and were mayor at the time. One of the things that came up repeatedly in the negotiations were Latin American states, including Ecuador, that were insistent on the introduction of the so-called right to the city. It's an idea that, as I understood it, originated in part with Henri Lefebvre, and and it was quoted at US and European negotiators quite frequently. I'd like to throw another quote from him back at you to start this off. He said, "A revolution that does not produce a new space has not realized its full potential. A social transformation, to be truly revolutionary in character, must manifest a creative capacity in its effect on daily life, on language, and on space." I know you built the first, or presided over the building of the first metro in Quito and in your country, and of course, a lot of heritage work. I'm curious to know how, when you thought about space, what the tent or collaborators you needed to find were. How many of them were local, how many were national, and how many of them were in fact global in nature?
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's really great to be back here. I have to say that this is a very fascinating topic for me because I witnessed how during those 5 or 3 years that Ian mentioned, cities have grown its role at the international level, and the new urban agenda and Habitat 3 was a very clear example of that, addressing some of the issues that Ian just mentioned, the right to the city and how we thought about public spaces as spaces to democratize cities in a greater way. And in order to do so, I think that cities are coming up with much more effective mechanism through the international arena than in the past. Habitat 3 was a very nice example of what can local governments do in order to contribute to international agreements. At that time, we developed through many networks of cities what was called the Global Task Force, which was a mechanism through which mayors and local authorities from around the world had a very active participation in providing with ideas and input for the construction of the new urban agenda. And this was done jointly with the United Nations system, which was something that wasn't done before, right? It is paradoxical to think that, for instance, during Habitat 1 or Habitat 2, even though those two conferences were addressing issues regarding urban development, they didn't have an active participation from mayors. Well, it's really difficult to explain why. The fact is that Habitat 3 was a huge change in that regard, and a very positive one. And that's a clear example of the kind of new role cities and local governments in general are playing at the international level, being part of, in this case, the UN mechanism for the construction of an international agreement. And there are some other examples of that, right? What cities are doing regarding the SDGs with the UN, and New York is a great example, and Penny will tell us about that, the way New York and other cities in the world are addressing the SDGs, which was thought at the beginning to be led by nations, but now we are realizing that cities are actually the places in where most of the SDG goals will be defined, right? And addressing what you were saying, Ian, regarding the right to the city, we found this kind of mechanism, the international discussion that was raised towards Habitat 3 as the right platform to address these kind of issues, taking advantage of different experiences from around the world, from different mayors that provided ideas on how to include that mayor's, that city's vision on the new urban agenda on very concrete terms.
Can I just sort of to press you on that for a parallel, or perhaps the lack of a parallel? I'm curious to know that multi-stakeholder story, that vertical story, that cities as active players, does that have a natural parallel in the actual development of the physical space that you helped oversee in Quito during that time? And so this sort of global, national, local story you just told about the new urban agenda, is the building of your metro or the preserving of your heritage sites and the wonderful city that Quito really is the same story? Or is it different in terms of where power sits and who's engaging?
I mean, of course, as mayors, we usually have to face different political scenarios nationally, right? And very frequently, and certainly that was my case, that scenario wasn't very friendly, a very friendly one, right? And that poses a huge challenge. But I found that even to address that kind of challenges, taking advantage, building upon what the international arena is providing cities with nowadays is very helpful. I found these international discussions to support our position from a city perspective, even to discuss issues at the national level. So it's a kind of new tools that mayors can use nowadays to address their agendas, to raise issues that are very difficult to discuss at the national level. And certainly that was the case with the metro line, with the heritage preservation scheme that we developed successfully, thanks in great part to the support we could raise internationally.
That makes sense. But Penny, I think I'd like to return later in this conversation. I'm sure there'll be many questions with regards to New York and its relationship to the nation state in which it sits. But of course, it's a very unique city. It's an island that sits off of it in many ways, but it's a unique city in the whole world, or Manhattan is at least. And I'm curious to know, shifting from the vertical to the horizontal quickly, you're very active as a city diplomat in the sort of multilateral space, in the network space. And I'm curious, trying to keep this grounded in urban spaces and in the practical management of a city, which you guys are preparing for the diplomatic world to arrive in a couple weeks. How you guys think about taking lessons from networks or taking lessons from other cities and applying them, and vice versa, and when that can be used and when one has to be very careful about local circumstances.
So I think the first thing I want to ground this is sort of the background in terms of why I'm active as a city diplomat and why my agency is active in this role. I run the mayor's office for international affairs, and New York City is host to the largest diplomatic corps in the world. It's not just the UN and the 193 permanent missions. We have 116 consulates and about 75 international trade commissions too. So we have international economic development coming out of my agency. And when I was appointed, next week it'll be 5 years, what the reality was is that historically this agency had been focused on the operational, the parking program, diplomatic incidents and security issues, and there was a real gap in trying to identify how best we can exchange best practices and take advantage of being host to such an important global community. If any of you are paying attention to the politics of New York City, whether now or back then, we are a very progressive administration that really wanted to take on climate change. We created universal pre-K in New York City. I benefited personally from the first paid parental leave that the city has ever had for New York City employees. So we were doing a lot of things that we wanted to make sure we were sharing both domestically, which we do, engaging in the network of the US Conference of Mayors, but we weren't doing that internationally. And so there was an opportunity in 2015. Mayor de Blasio launched One NYC, which is our development agenda post-Sandy, around how you look at resiliency and sustainability with a strong equity lens. And because of that strong equity lens, when we mapped it to the SDGs, which were agreed to later that year in September, we had synergies with all of the sustainable development goals. So we created a platform called Global Vision Urban Action, which was distinctly about sharing best practices on policies. And we had been building out that work, and then what happened was this current administration, which sort of blew up the way the norms were in terms of how you interact. Was that diplomatic? That's pretty diplomatic, right?
These days, yeah.
As diplomatic as I'm feeling right now. And so that is really, and the reason I give you that background is it was something that I didn't appreciate when January 2017 hit, was how important a trusted reputation would be with the UN community in particular. Because now you had a State Department and a US mission to the UN that was actively disengaging, right? One of the first acts of the Trump administration was to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so within 18 hours, we signed our own executive order where we committed directly to the Paris Climate Agreement. We worked with the US Conference of Mayors, and now 420 US cities are directly committed to the Paris Climate Agreement. So we saw not only a real opportunity, but a desire from the UN and the international community to engage with New York City, sure, we're host city, but New York City is also as large, if not larger, than 141 countries from a population perspective, but we're also not the island of Manhattan. So we show up with the humility of how are we dealing with structural inequities throughout East New York, the South Bronx, and that again allowed us to engage with UN and with other cities and states, I think in a way that that desire and that need hadn't existed, at least for New York City. And in this period, this is when we started engaging with UCLG and the Global Task Force and all of these networks. And what's been really interesting to see is how they have strategically created opportunities like the Urban 20. I think we have all participated in that. But how are we as a collective influencing that conversation? So New York City has seen how we can influence policies and how we can encourage and bring in new specific policy ideas and innovations for our own purpose. But what do we agree on as a network that we can then push national government? So that's been a little bit of the evolution. I'm not sure if I answered your question specifically, but I just wanted to give a little bit of that evolution.
No, so the model, I'm thinking about someone like James Scott who would want to argue at us that all cities are sort of different. You have to know them in this sort of this fundamental sort of way that's very difficult to apply as cookie cutter from place to place. The alternative are individuals in some approaches that are taken by some development banks where you can just ask 12 questions to understand an urban space. But for the network, what you do is you take the information and you would apply it through your bureaucracy for best practices, and then upward it's about political motivation.
And it's interesting, you were talking about space specifically with Maurizio around physical space, but what the last couple of years has also allowed us as cities and city networks is space to influence. And I'll talk about the voluntary local review, but whether it's Habitat, whether it's the Secretary General's office and the desire to see cities at the table. I've read your piece, what's that? A seat at the table, and you said we're not at the table, but we can bring food to the party.
You can bring food to the party.
But you know what? We don't have a permanent seat, but they're definitely making that space. And an example that I have is the Global Compact on Migration. In 2017, 2018, that was the focus of the UN community. And we obviously knew the US government would not be anywhere near that particular conversation, but it was just really important. Listen, we don't know, we can't control what's at the border, but what we do is control how we deal with our new neighbors, right? Cities have to be cities as large as New York City, but smaller cities that are getting the overflow around the world need to be at the table talking about what we're actually doing when the flow comes into our communities. And they gave us a seat at that table. A couple of mayors spoke at the end and essentially testified during the negotiations. We were invited to the final signing that happened in Morocco. But this is like, again, it's that space, they allocated space for us, and we as a collective are finally, I think, coordinated enough to take advantage of that.
And you two work together actually closely, if I'm not wrong, on the migration.
Yeah, that's right. And
Henri-Paul, I'd be curious to know, sort of, you've been a diplomat at the United Nations as well, as an ambassador for Canada there, and as deputy.
You could look a little bit more excited about that.
And I'm glad I'm not there this September. I leave it all to Penny.
And obviously think about this from a city level. Talk to us a little bit about the diplomatic norms, how you exchange information very quickly to stand up, something like that. The work you guys are about to do around biodiversity. We know, some of us in the room, I bet, about the 300 city networks, over half of which are global. We have representatives of some of the major ones here with us today. I think Penny just spoke that a little bit. Talk to us about the sort of entrepreneurial side of meeting policy challenges that maybe national governments or certainly cities haven't yet.
Yes. And you asked Ian at the very beginning the question, what is new? And actually, I'll start with a little anecdote with my personal experience about what's new. When I was serving at the United Nations some 12 years ago, one day I received a phone call, office of the mayor of Montreal, so happens, who's coming to New York, to the UN, and he wants a meeting. So, I look at my schedule, okay, I'll make time for him. And I thought, this is very nice, this is very cute, I'll have a meeting with him, and it was very nice. And at the end of the meeting, I thought, Well, now let me go back to my real business, in the office and my real stuff. So that was 12 years ago. Times have changed. Okay? Now when cities and when mayors show up at the UN and elsewhere, they're being listened to. And I think that is fundamentally new. Not to say that cities have never been involved internationally. They have. The first association of cities, actually, was created in 1913, so it's been a while. But as you said in your introduction, the kind of involvement by cities on the global scene has changed qualitatively. Examples of that, and actually it's in Quito, when Mauricio hosted us for UN Habitat a few years ago, that he launched with a number of others, the movement A Seat at the Global Table that you talked about, you referred to, Penny. And increasingly so, we are taking a seat at the global table, invited or not. Like in the case of migration, we sort of invited ourselves, and it worked. So when we say we're at the global table, what are examples of this? I think migration is a great example. There was an international discussion at the UN level, and we showed up. We actually influenced the discussions, and we're now recognized as actors. So migration is one example. The other obvious example is climate change, okay? Cities were actively present in Paris at COP21, and we've been mobilized ever since. That's another example. I may surprise you, but cities are also involved on security issues in different ways. Where does radicalization take place? Often it's in cities. So for instance, in Montreal, we established a Center for the Prevention of Radicalization and a number of other initiatives to promote social cohesion. And then I would flag a new frontier, actually, where cities are getting involved. Cities have been very influential on the climate change issue. Now, next year is a major conference on biodiversity, COP15 on biodiversity in China. There's actually no real political momentum on biodiversity like there was and there still is on climate change. So basically, we've decided to pick up that ball. Our Mayor Plante, has been appointed as Global Ambassador for Local Biodiversity, and we're going to try to mobilize cities, and we're going to be there in China next year to try to influence the debate and to act ourselves as well. So these are examples of cities taking their place at the global table on issues that are both global and also local at the same time.
Yeah, I think that the notion that you're at the table, even if you're not invited, and Mauricio and Penny's discussion of being active on the global stage despite your national government begs a lot of questions that we're going to get to, and they should be provocative because it's a political space. But I actually have a question for any of you who want to tackle it. It's going to seem very unhip, but we have a lot of students here, I assume people who actually think about their careers, and no one thinks they're going to have a career in a bureaucracy, I think. It's a very fulfilling place to have a career sometimes, but it's rarely the ambition. This year there was two interesting books on diplomacy written, I think, one by Bill Burns and a second by George Packer on Richard Holbrooke. And they're both, in a sense, about these globe-trotting men, but they're really actually about the bureaucracy that makes diplomacy work. And I wonder if any of you could speak to your experience with taking global ideas and implementing them through your local bureaucracies, and perhaps finding within your own staffs great stuff that you were able to amplify upwards.
Okay, to go. Well, I think that it will be a great idea to become part of a city diplomacy bureaucracy, because as opposed to the national bureaucracy diplomacy, first of all, this one is much more fun. Second of all, it is much more effective for a number of reasons. City diplomacy is non-ideological, as opposed to national government's diplomacy. It's much less formal, right? It's much more practical, right? And it is based in a huge cooperation spirit, right? I always mention the fact that every time I have the opportunity to talk to a mayor, I asked him or her what was his best policies, regardless of their political affiliation. I didn't care whether she or he was from the right or from the left. I didn't think about that. I just asked him or her what was his or her ideas to share in a cost-benefit perspective, right? So I am a huge believer in the future of city diplomacy. I think the role of cities will keep on growing over time at the international arena precisely because of these reasons, because it is effective. It yields concrete results that you could implement in a fast way and generate benefit for the people very soon. And also because we should think about the fact that it is in cities where some of the world's most pressing issues, like climate change, like migration, will be defined. So we should come up with ways for that definition to be positive, to address properly all of these challenges at the city level where they will be defined and where it is most likely for them to be defined because of the possibilities cities have to implement things in a fast and effective way.
So we say to all our federal government colleagues in here, get to a different bureaucracy.
Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to answer that a little bit differently, because one of in owning the city diplomacy and the leadership that, when I was trying to figure out what I was doing with this agency, the reality is that we're paid by New Yorkers. We're paid by taxpayers. So I get the importance of all of that, but how do we then convince other city agencies? My agency doesn't implement policies, right? That's what's happening at the Department of Transportation or Education or in our Office of Response and Resilience. And what we needed to, and then we have the New Yorkers who, are annoyed by the fact that we are the largest, we host the largest diplomatic corps for the entire month of September when they can't move around Manhattan, right? And so there is an aspect of work that is very, very serious that you need to do with your citizens and your colleagues. We have done that in a couple of different ways. So after we mapped our One NYC to the Sustainable Development Goals, created Global Vision Urban Action, my team literally had to go to every agency. I'm calling every other commissioner and agency head and having to sell them on why it is important for their teams to start thinking about their work with this global lens, because it brings value to their work. There is that sort of selling and diplomacy at your peer level. And then with New Yorkers, you need to, for people who are just trying to just survive their daily life, how do you make the impact of a global movement resonate in their lives? And we did that through engaging young people. So we have a program called New York City Junior Ambassadors, where there's a number of different things, but educators integrate an SDG into their curriculum. The kids activate around it. Because we host the largest diplomatic corps, we're able to get the ambassadors out to their schools. But the most important thing about this is that the end of the program, these kids do something in their community related to that SDG. So SDG 14 is life underwater, right? The most boring, wonkiest sounding thing to a 14-year-old, maybe to a 30-year-old, right? And what we now have are kids in the South Bronx who are committed to cleaning up the South Bronx River, because that's how they're activating on SDG 14. But now you have kids in Staten Island, in East New York, who are going home and talking about the UN, the SDGs to their parents, and that direct link is made. But that's part of the bureaucracy, is how do you ensure that your colleagues in city government that are doing the work are invested, but those who fundamentally pay your salary are also.
Actually, I'm one of those who moved from the federal diplomacy to the urban diplomacy, and I agree with Mauricio, it's much more fun. And actually, when I speak with my former colleagues in Ottawa, and I tell them how I operate in Montreal versus how we were operating in Ottawa, I tell them, listen, if I want a decision, an executive decision, I just write an SMS to my mayor, and I have an answer within the hour, and then I can go on. So they listen to me with a bit of envy. And of envy. By the way, urban diplomacy, when we started to use that term, some people told me, urban diplomacy, it's an oxymoron, Diplomacy is for states. But actually, when you look at what is diplomacy, actually, there's no universally accepted definition of diplomacy. So I sort of came up with my own, and essentially, diplomacy it's the art of pursuing your objectives and your interests through interaction with a range of stakeholders. Whatever your objectives or your interests are, of course, so nation states have a certain range of objectives and interests and certain powers, and so do cities. So that's what we do. We promote our objectives and our interests. And Ian, you were asking about the link between what happens at the city level and at the global level. Very quickly, I'll pick two examples. One is climate change, one is living together. I'll get back to this. Climate change. Cities were part of the problem because we do emit a lot of gases, but we're also part of the solution. So many cities, New York, Quito, Montreal, we take initiatives in our own city. But we're not going to have a huge impact in our own city if other cities don't act as well. I mean, we could reduce our emissions to 0 in Montreal, but if New York next door continues to emit, we're going to suffer from climate change. So if we want to have an impact in Montreal, we have to be active on the global stage. So some of the initiatives that we do in Montreal, other cities are interested in, and vice versa. We learn from the experience of other cities. And actually, when there was the Climate Action Summit in San Francisco last year, there's a network of cities who are active on climate change called the C40, and they came up with a brilliant idea, actually. They came up with a menu of things that cities could commit to. So you could say, well, Montreal will commit to objective number 1 and objective or measure number 3. So a lot of us, by peer pressure, we act more and more. But not only are we actors, we're also advocate in favor of action on climate change. So that's one example. The second example I'll take. Terrorism, of course, is sadly a major issue. A couple of years ago, there were quite a few attacks, particularly in France. So the then mayor of Montreal said, we got to do something about that. So he convened a summit of mayors on the issue of living together. What is living together? It's essentially about promoting diversity, inclusion, social cohesion, and so on. What can we do in the city to make sure that people from diverse origins, et cetera, live together in peace? So we held that summit, and that became actually an international network. I'm just back from a meeting of that network in Düsseldorf last week. What did we do? We shared our city experiences on the issue of living together. How do we go about this? So at the same time as we did that, we sort of promoted the idea of living together. And ultimately, the impact that this has on the well-being of our citizens in our cities is positive, and it also has an impact on issues of security that are of concern, of course, nationally and internationally. So these are concrete examples of how we can make the link between the cities, the issues that our citizens face, and how we can address these together globally.
This point about the fact that unless everyone's acting globally, your successes at home won't be the same. It's at the heart of a lot of unease around globalization, of course, that people feel like they don't have influence, decision capacity over things that ultimately affect their lives. But Penny, you mentioned the political dynamic of having to communicate to the taxpayers of New York City. And this is a long-standing diplomatic challenge. Diplomats in their broad pinstripe suits in Washington and in London never thought they had to explain what they did had value, and still struggle to do so. And in the State Department today, there's still an exhibit every year called Faces of Diplomacy that are pictures of diplomats inside the State Department for other diplomats to look at.
We can't blame that on Trump.
But we're going to open up the questions in just one sec, but I want to, Michael mentioned the Great Powers in Urbanization project, and one of the things we're trying to do here is merge these conversations around urban solutions and cities being actors on the global stage, and some of the shift in global terrain. And I have a slightly maybe controversial question, and Henri-Paul, you can answer in French if you want, and you're hosting a major diplomatic gathering, Penny, so you can just pass if you like. Mauricio, you have to answer. You're no longer.
What is this question?
But how do you?
I'm excited for
Not all mayors have a. Mauricio said that it's not ideological, but of course, not all mayors have the same relationship with their national governments. Not all mayors are elected, and some of them operate globally, not on the behest, but certainly for governments that are much more centrally controlled. So how do you think about the diplomatic engagement with your counterparts who might come from cities, we don't have to name any of them, where they actually don't have democratic legitimacy, but of course they have policy implementation capacity, which is the most exciting thing when you put ideology aside. But sometimes you can't put ideology aside. And so when you're meeting in these networks, what goes through your head as a diplomat to think about, well, they also might come from a nation state that has a slightly different perspective or doesn't give this city the same authority as, say, the mayor of New York has or the mayor of Montreal.
We have to be very conscious of the politics of this and the geopolitics, actually. But as a general proposition, I would say that when we work with cities and mayors from countries that you described, actually, we tend to be more pragmatic than ideologic. How can we tackle together those issues? And how can we find common ground or encourage each other to act in a positive direction? But sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes people have different values and sometimes not. But there is here actually a fundamental difference in terms of urban diplomacy versus nation-state diplomacy, is that for nation states, you have no choice but to be involved in international relations. It's there, you're a state, you're a member of the UN, you are there, you're called upon to take decisions and to interact with each other for your security and so on. But as cities, if I can put it this way, international involvement is optional, okay? Of course, the wise cities, get involved internationally. But mostly city networks, cities that get involved and city networks, their involvement is voluntary. So if I sit together with a mayor from another city from another country which doesn't share the same values and same objectives as myself, I don't necessarily have to sit with that mayor or that city. If I want to decide that I'd rather work with other cities, that's what I'll do. So that's a fundamental change, I think, in the dynamics. So we've got to be conscious of those issues, but they play out in a very different way, I think, in the urban diplomacy world. And actually, those cities that tend to be most active, again, as a general proposition, tend to be the cities which are most progressive. And there's sort of a bit of a commonality of interests, values, and objectives.
So I've approached it differently because my agency mandates that I serve all 193 permanent members in a similar fashion, especially how they operate throughout New York City. I found the Sustainable Development Goals to be a phenomenal sort of framework from which you step out of ideology and you identify the areas in which there are commonalities and focus on that. I meet with the ambassadors from pretty much every country, right? And part of it is not just to have a courtesy meeting, but to figure out how can we move forward on an agenda that is of common value. So we created the concept of a voluntary local review last year. So the UN, since the SDGs were agreed to, have invited national governments during the high-level political forum, which is every summer, to submit what's called a voluntary national review to report where they're at in terms of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. This is an opportunity to show off what's working, but also share what's not, in the hope of providing this information in a transparent form and exchanging best practices. We knew that the US government was very unlikely to do a VNR, so we took our trusted relationship with the UN and the Secretary General and suggested, what about a voluntary local review? New York City would love to show up on the SDGs, share what's working and what is not. They agreed to this, and so we submitted the first voluntary local review. Now in the last year, it's become a movement. We have a New York City declaration that will be signed on UN campus on September 25th, but this is trying to get US, and this is all subnational leadership. So this again takes just out of mayors, but into other, in the US, we would love to have mayors and governors representing states signing this. And I think that has allowed us to engage with cities and states that we might have ideological differences with, but to focus on, you know, I had a phenomenal meeting with the Perm Rep of China just yesterday, and they are very strong in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. Next year is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and they are very excited about a lot of the reporting that they're going to do. A number of the cities, there are about 5 cities throughout China that we are hoping to recruit for this voluntary local review that they're actively going to help us on. To me, this is such a great way for us to get past ideology and actually engage on moving forward the issues that we care about. So the SDGs have really been that framework for New York City and the way that my agency engages with not only the diplomatic corps, but our counterparts around the world. And the one other thing I want to say as an American is that most Americans don't appreciate the power that cities and states have in our system. And what we have been able to show through the SDGs and other engagement on climate change, on migration, is what cities can do as you are watching our particular national government abdicate its responsibility on with multilateral institutions. So we have an ideological issue with our own government, but there's still an extreme opportunity in that.
I would like to build upon what Henri-Paul and Penny said. I think there's also a very important difference between cities and nations diplomacy, and is that city diplomacy, for the most part, is thematically focused, okay? So you have networks of initiatives for climate change, for migration, for SDGs fulfillment. So when you have that kind of discussion, you just get away from discussing democracy or freedom, not because it's not important, but it's because it's not the issue you are discussing about and the issue upon which you will establish a cooperation spirit. So I think that really helps, because once again, it makes city diplomacy much more practical, much more concrete, and much more results-oriented.
Yeah, very much.
I bet there were some in the crowd who would try to argue with you that there are concepts such as justice and rights involved climate action, but that's what we're here to do. So I think now would be a good time to open it up. I don't know if any of you have been watching the goings-on in Parliament, but there's this guy who sits in the front called John Burkow, and he says, "Order!
Order.
Order!" That is not me for this part. There's a mic going on, and order will follow the mic.
Excellent. And if you could introduce yourself, and if you have a PEN affiliation, let us know. If you're a workshop participant, please do. And keep your question brief and have it end in a question mark. We would appreciate it.
Order.
Order.
Barb Cormenis. I am from the University of Michigan and a conference participant. So I have multiple questions, so I'll ask one, and if no one else wants to ask after that, I'll continue. So I was struck by this idea that city diplomacy is voluntary, but international is not. So as somebody who specializes in international politics, I think I'd have to disagree with that. That international law is voluntary, so I'm not sure that there's a qualitative difference. And I'm just thinking, for instance, when we just think across different international regimes, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, India, Israel have opted out. Human rights, there's lots of U.S. opting out of certain things. Same thing with climate, just across the International Criminal Court. And so you might see more universal engagement because coercion is maybe a little easier in the international sphere, so there may be a quantitative difference. But I guess I was just puzzled by what you meant by voluntary in that regard. So the question is, what did you mean by voluntary?
Okay, I'll answer right away, okay. I think we're talking about different things. And I so happen to be a lawyer too, but I'm not talking about international law, otherwise would bore everybody here in this room. But in very concrete terms, okay, let's take climate change again. If you're a nation state, if you're in Paris, you're there a few years ago, you have to negotiate that agreement. Nation states may agree, may not agree, they commit to things. Okay. For cities, Our involvement in Paris, only those of us who wanted to go went. If I don't want to act on climate change in my city, and I don't want to interact with other cities on the issue of climate change, I don't have to. If I'm a nation state, I have to. I'm stuck. Whether or not I act or not, I'm going to be criticized, but I'm there. I'm called upon. As a city, whether or not I go, I participate is my decision. So you have cities, you know, in any country, including in the US, which are very active internationally, and other cities, you just don't see them at all in international meetings. So that's what I mean by your involvement in international affairs is on a voluntary basis. Of course, you're subject to all the laws and this and that, but your own involvement is your decision.
Can I add something? I think that in city diplomacy, you as a mayor, as a city, can get as much as you put into. If you just don't want to put anything on it, you don't get anything. But if you are willing to get a lot, you should put a lot, and you usually get a lot. So I think that's the kind of focus through which you should look at city diplomacy as an opportunity, because it is a great opportunity to get concrete things if you know how to manage it.
Hi, Jeannie Birch from the University of Pennsylvania, a conference participant. Much diplomacy deals with trade, and so I'm wondering how cities might deal with trade and economic development.
With trade?
Trade.
Well, there's a fascinating example about that with the trade deal that Chicago signed with Mexico City, right, a few years ago. That's a very concrete example, and I think we will be seeing more of that in the future. I think city diplomacy will keep expanding different areas of action, and trade certainly will be one of them.
I'd actually like to just pick up on Jeannie's point as well, unless you guys want. I'm curious to know, you brought up a couple times, Henri-Paul, the degree to which climate change, and now the SDGs as well, as cities are very actively organized around them. Am I wrong in thinking that there is, that the architecture for city collaboration is much different? Maybe it's chambers of commerce, maybe it's U.S. Conference of Mayors, around trade issues. It doesn't have the same international dimension. It doesn't have the same sort of collective action, political force that we're seeing around climate and the SDGs and some other issues, or how do you all work together internationally on economic, or not?
Cities have always done economic promotion and trade promotion. I think all of us do it in a very pragmatic way. However, we are not involved in norm setting. International norm setting for trade is really done by nation states. It's not done by cities. So I think, again, that's another kind of difference between nation-state diplomacy and city diplomacy. So we promote our own economic interests and so on. We work bilaterally with other cities and so on, but it doesn't have this norm-setting agenda. And I would add one thing actually of interest for the US, Canada, when there were these negotiations on the renewal or not of NAFTA in the last little while, a number of cities in the US and in Canada, in terms of advocacy, came out in favor of a better free trade deal. Cities did not want to scrap NAFTA or something like NAFTA because mayors understand that the economic well-being in their cities depends partly on free trade. So to some extent, cities and mayors became policy advocates in favor of the NAFTA or the renewal of NAFTA. So I think that that's worth underlining. So no role in norm setting, but policy advocacy, yes. And of course, in practice, promoting our own economic interests, that happens. That has happened forever. That's not new, actually. Has happened for a long time by cities.
And that's exactly right around that, not having the norm-setting power, but I've found that the majority of international affairs type of roles in the US are around economic development. That's the way they justify that particular role, and that's right, because they're more policy advocates and attracting in.
Hello, my name is Will. I'm a visitor. I was wondering how exactly cities are defined here. So the political unit of a city often doesn't quite match up to the political conurbation that it occupies. For instance, most of the population of Buenos Aires don't live within the autonomous city of Buenos Aires, which is a distinct political entity. And I was wondering what ramifications that has, for instance, in controlling carbon emissions if you're not dealing with a single political entity that may be less poorly defined when you come into conurbation, or even something like Philadelphia, which is spread across, where the conurbation is spread across multiple states. So you're having to get multiple parties working together. What would be your take on that?
I don't know if we've have a definition of this.
There's there's not a definition of what a city is in terms of city diplomacy. And actually, what's interesting, you mentioned the example of Buenos Aires, but very close to it, Santiago de Chile, right? There's a metropolitan mayor who is actually appointed by the president, and you have small municipalities mayors who are elected by the people, right? And I remember having diplomatic relationships with both of them, right? So that usually happens in city diplomacy. You don't, that's the kind of questions you usually don't make, right? But rather you start cooperating, regardless if this guy is from the metropolitan area or just a small municipality. I don't know if you Henri-Paul and Penny would agree. You interact with either of them.
I agree with that, and I will say around the Sustainable Development Goals and the movement that we've been doing with the UN, that is what you brought up is one of the most significant challenges in identifying what partners should be part of it. And so that's why we've sort of shifted the language to subnational leadership, because you really need to figure out what is the sort of the largest group of power brokers, decision makers you can have in this, right? Because we're also talking, I'm talking about the US, but when you start talking about India and countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it becomes very complicated when you start thinking about what city, what mayor you're engaging. So that's part of the reason why we broadened it to sort of local regional governments in that sense.
Question.
Hi, I'm a master's student in city planning here at Penn, and I know that a lot of cities are dealing with the urban-rural divide and how to balance that is becoming more of a pressing issue politically as well and affecting our politics. I think we can see that in the US and in the UK, and I'm just wondering what you think the role is of a city in addressing the disparity between the urban and rural.
Give that to a mayor.
You know, this question comes up very, very frequently in a way that makes you think automatically that cities have the power, have the economic engine, and rural doesn't. And I think that is undermining the power and the ability for rural communities to be part of this. Again, to the gentleman next to you, I don't know if he's your friend, but the gentleman, to the question that you ask, I mean, again, when we talk about cities, or when I'm talking about cities in terms of our movement, it's not just the large cities. We need cities from around the US, around the world participating in this, and that means small places, right? And that really is one of the challenges, because we need to have this conversation in a way where we aren't taking their power away. They have the power. It's not that it just sits in the city. We collaborate with them. There is no way that New York State functions without the partnerships that we have throughout sort of every sector of New York State. And so I'm not answering your question, but I do think we need to think about how we ask that question, because we're sort of undermining the power that I think rural areas very actively have.
And also the fact that, going also back to the previous question, when you look, for example, the case of my city, what's called the Metropolitan District of Quito, of which I was the mayor, only has 6% of the territory urban. 95% of the metropolitan district of Quito is rural. So I had to deliver policies for the urban and the rural areas and how to complement them in an effective way. So this is probably a feature that not many cities in the world have, right? So this is the kind of conversations that I rarely had with other mayors, right? I mostly had conversations about things that we had in common so we could cooperate on them.
Hi, my name is Melissa. I'm a student here at the University of Pennsylvania. My thought was just that cities across the world are very different. And so when you speak of having kind of collective goals that you talk about together but must be implemented individually, is there any accountability within the cities themselves to hold other cities, accountable for these goals that they're trying to accomplish? Or is it more like, let's hope that they are pursuing those goals, right? So
I think it's mostly the latter, actually. There are a few exceptions. I come back again to the issue of climate change. There's much more to talk about in terms of city involvement in climate change, but this one offers interesting examples. Again, in the summit, in the Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, cities were invited to voluntarily take on some commitments of their choice in a long list. Now, once you sign up on one of them, the C40, this network, which is extremely well organized, quite unique actually, they're on our back. They follow us, they get statistics, they ask reports from us, and they even score us. They say, of all these things that you're supposed to do, well, as of September 2019, we give you a 60% mark. It's very serious. So, and actually, I keep saying to my colleagues from the climate change department in my city, I say, in my case, I do all the nice talk internationally, but you guys have to deliver, So, but this is the exception more than the rule. In most other cases, it's an encouragement, it's a bit of peer pressure, but not necessarily serious, hard commitments. There are only a few exceptions, I would think. I don't know if you can think of others, but it's mostly like this. I think SDGs also is a nice commitment. People want to act. Countries have to account, but in the case of cities, again, it's voluntary.
It's voluntary, but and this is part of the reason the voluntary local review. I think the important thing to note, C40 is very sophisticated. It is focused on an urgent issue, and there are a lot of other urgent issues. I think what's important to note is a lot of these movements are relatively new as well, right? Yeah. So getting back to the earlier part of our conversation, we're creating spaces, we're being entrepreneurial and trying to figure out how to take the seat at the table. I don't know how old C40 and 100 Resilient Cities are, but they're relatively new and they're very well funded, right? So we also need to make our case for how do we do that around issues of whether it's migration, counterterrorism, or affordable housing. And so I think that is just, I think the one thing that we need to just sit in is how young this all is to a certain extent.
Yeah, I totally agree. This is evolving. This changes very rapidly, yeah. Right? And the nice thing, once again, the reason why I feel so passionately about city diplomacy is precisely that. You can shape it, right? Absolutely. We can shape it. We can make it work, right? Learning on the way as we go. Learning from these examples, right? From what's being successful and that can be replicated in other areas. What's being done regarding climate change could be done regarding migration, for example, in cities, right? So that's the beauty of it, right? We are introducing new criteria based on results.
And it actually gets to the heart of something that keeps coming up around the voluntary local review. A lot of cities or subnational governments are just saying, nope, it's too much work. And it's interesting because they point to C40. To be part of C40, you literally have to have staff that have been hired specifically to do that work.
Absolutely.
So that is a lot of funding, that is a lot of resource, and this is where all of these pieces need to come in. We're doing the city diplomacy of, creating its value at the global level. It's the work that we're doing with our citizens and our colleagues in our cities to explain the importance of why you need to think about the SDGs and to engage. But again, part of what we have done is create a very low barrier for entry to do a voluntary local review, largely because so many turned away and said, we just can't afford to do it. And especially you start going into the global south, we can't afford to do it. We have too many other problems. We don't want another reporting mechanism. And so again, this is where a little bit of the marketing of our work comes in as well.
Hey guys, Seth Schultz. I know a couple of you guys, and I'm fortunate to rep a number of these organizations and city networks we've been talking about, quite a few of them in fact, and I may have had something to do with this monitoring and measurement program you're talking about. But I want to be a little provocative here on the broader kind of conversation about cities and the diplomacy, and kind of pick up a little bit where you're going. Actually, I'm on the kind of marketing side of this. 25 years ago, there was 10 city networks. Now, as you mentioned, from one of the latest studies, there's like over 300. Part of that was the fact that cities were outsiders looking in, and we could market that, and it was voluntary, and it was kind of grassroots and guerrilla, and a lot of exciting things happened. And one of the ways we were able to do that was market mayors like Mayor Rodas, who we worked a lot with, on creating an international platform for them to be able to do some of those things. And because of the ability to get recognized, they could make those difficult trips when you're getting paid by taxpayers to be in your city, not someplace else. So it is kind of marketing in it, but cities are a positive race to the top, which is why this kind of happens. But I'm actually worried about the direction of travel a little bit, about kind of gentrifying, so to speak, the political nature of cities. Because we started making inroads and we created things like U20 and it's getting more formalized, but a lot of it goes back to accountability and tracking. So there's negotiating with national governments about a formal seat and about formal funding mechanisms to get that money. There's a whole nother layer of requirement and detail that often cities cannot deliver on because of the how they're set up, but based on the urban agglomeration, it's very hard for them to turn around and tangibly deliver on these things. And at the same time, cities have been racing ahead on the advocacy side, but they haven't been able to deliver because they don't have all the power and they don't have the money. So now the rubber is meeting the road here internationally about what cities can and can't deliver. And at the same time, cities are now saying, oh, and we now demand a formal representation in these processes, but it's not an equal footing. And if we do get on the inside of this now, will we lose the ability for guerrilla tactics, and is it going to be as impactful? So it's kind of a question I'd throw up to the group here.
Are y'all too grown up to have fun?
I'm like, we're being streamed, is what I want to say.
Yeah, but I think you've got a very valid point. But in terms of being both inside and outside, I always say that for us to be credible advocates, we have to be actors as well. If we're not actors, we won't be taken seriously. And you're right that in a number of instances, we just don't have the resources to do everything that we would like to do. For instance, on the issue of sustainable mobility and all the infrastructure and the investments that this requires. In many cases, we just don't have the resources in cities to do that if we want to make our contribution to some specific contributions to climate change. But I think that we have this. But there are cases, many cases, we actually are actors, where actually our voice is being listened to. I take again the example of security and acting on social cohesion. As we do it, national governments are beginning to recognize that, yes, indeed, we are actors. When we set up this center to prevent radicalization in Montreal, at first, other levels of government looked at that and thought, what is this about? And after a while, they realized that, hey, this is serious, not only for Montreal, but in terms of national security, and they started investing in it. So all these issues are linked, and yes, cities will have to continue to ask for more resources, but I think that with what we have currently, I think in a number of areas, we have enough to be credible actors and be at that table.
Thank you so much. I'm Lama Murad. I'm one of the postdoctoral fellows here at Perry World House. And it's a really fascinating discussion. And I work on migration and cities in the global south. So I wanted to pick up a little bit on Henri-Paul's comment that most cities, are doing progressive work, let's say, as a general principle.
Those that are involved internationally.
Those that are involved. So the question is, one, is that changing? Are cities that may not have the most progressive views on issues like migration, are they starting to think about how they can produce their own networks? And so I'm thinking, for instance, the most recent mayor of Istanbul has just called for the displacement of Syrian migrants or refugees, depending on the terminology that you want to use in that context, in its city that are not registered within the city to other areas, and has called for actually a meeting of other mayors who are struggling with the refugee crisis more broadly in the region. So to think about what is the role, is that changing? Are sort of cities with quote unquote bad politics, kind of if we can agree on that, with regards to issues like migration, starting to learn the lessons of the progressive cities? And what is the role of progressive city networks encountering, in the US, we can think of cities that are cooperating with, 287G, we can think about, the deputization of local police. So all of these issues, what are the roles of these networks in countering that?
I think they are making a very important contribution in that regard, because they are helping many cities around the world to assume a progressive stance on different issues. And then when the mayor gets back to the city, this guy will not only promote that vision, but also promote the replication of that vision in other cities in the same country and even from the national government. Let's take the example of migration. In Quito, we've had, like in many places in Latin America, a huge migration flow from Venezuela in the past couple of years, right? And we all know that it is in cities where the effect of migration is most visible, right? And you as a city, you have to respond with public services, with housing, with infrastructure, with jobs, with many things for migrants, right? And of course, we in Quito, we manage a very progressive vision regarding migration. And by doing so, we also put pressure on the national government regarding the issue to act in the same way, right? By promoting the replication by example, right? So just like you can do that at the national level, you can do it with other cities at the international level, with concrete examples.
From my perspective, to answer your specific question, do we see much of these new developments happening? I have not seen much. I must admit I was not aware of this initiative from Istanbul, but personally I have not seen much of that. But let me use an interesting example here between the international networks and the national networks, because the national networks, like the US Conference of Mayors, or in the case of Canada, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, in national networks, basically you're part of it. Whoever is the mayor in power, whatever the political color, you're a member of that organization. And again, you have to be there, that's all. When Canada hosted the G7 last year, for the first time ever in the history of the G7, mayors wrote to the G7 leaders. First time ever. So Montreal, because it was in Canada, we took the leadership, we drafted a letter, and we rallied people around the world, basically to present an urban perspective on the issues that were on the G7 table. Now, the interesting part is this. So we had about three, four subjects that we were addressing. And on the issue of climate change, we were rather progressive because I was collecting support from cities and networks from around the world who are more or less committed. Now, I needed also to get some support from the Canadian Federation of Municipalities. And actually, the people at the Federation told me, well, don't go too far on that issue, because within our national organizations, the points of view on climate change are not all the same. So I was afraid at some point in time that I might find myself in the embarrassing situation where the cities from my own country would not want to go as far as the other cities I was dealing with. But that illustrates the dynamic, and again, a different dynamic between the international networks and the national networks.
That also happens in the international networks, trying to agree to the the U20 communique
True.
to the G20. You know, what you're saying and what you're observing is absolutely true. And you know, if a mayor or the representative for a subnational government is not progressive on migration, they might be on climate. And I think that might be a little bit of the value of having sort of issue focused, because doing the G20 communique is very, very difficult, right? So New York City has really invested in sort of climate accountability. So we are divesting billions from our pension funds. We're suing the big 5 fossil fuel companies. Like 60%, I think, of our colleagues who we would, in this conversation, talk about as progressive, we're like, hell no. Like, there is no way we're going to go that far. So you have that, but again, I think what we are here to say is that we have a seat, or we're taking a seat at the table, but we have to meet each other where we're at, right? I have no idea who the next mayor of New York City is going to be. I have no idea how they will run this agency and these programs, but we have to set sort of a stable level of just rationality around, you know, sort of based on all these issues where you hope they will play ball at, right? Climate, they don't have to go as far as the de Blasio administration has, but they actively continue to engage C40, for example, or the Global Compact on Migration. So I think this is just this is the diplomatic piece of it, right? You're sitting down with somebody you agree with on 2 things and not 5, so you just focus on the 2. But
Hi, my name is Nadia Bantek. I'm from Villanova Law School, so a workshop participant. I wanted to, I think we're sort of touching on this, but only at the edges of the matter. And I want to go back to the point made about norm setting versus policy setting. And I wanted to ask what your position is. How do you see yourselves? I understand that there's a lot of policy setting, but then I'm thinking of instances in which cities have actually tagged along into international agreements. See the Paris Climate Agreement. Situations in which cities actively implement international law that the federal government or the national government is actively rejecting. So to me, these are instances in which cities are trying to become norm setters, norm implementers, but at the same time, I hear you talk about how you're not norm setters and implementers, you're more policy setters. So I wanted to hear more about how you understand your position in that realm, and also whether this is something that you see a uniform stance on. Do cities want to sit on the table, but on which table? The policymaking table? The lawmaking table? Is there a distinction even?
This is fascinating, actually. And even though as a general proposition, I think the cities are more in the field of policy setting, there are some instances and some issues where actually we connect with norm setting. I'll use a few examples. In Montreal, the city council endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as an example, okay? It's more of a policy statement rather than something with legal obligations, except customary law might kick in, actually. But that's an example. Another example, still in Montreal, years ago, we developed in Montreal the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities of Citizens. Of course, partly inspired by the UN Declaration, but we tried to put that in a more city context. So that's another example. The last example I'll use at a different level is about migration. Actually, this time around, as Penny was saying, we were at the table and we actually influenced the content of the global compacts. Okay, I don't want to overstate it, but we did it. So that is part of norm setting, even though the global compacts, are not, treaties or with legal obligations, but still, that's an example where actually cities contributed to norm setting. And I think that we can expect that in the future, there will be more of that.
Yeah, I totally agree. The global compacts on migration and refugees are great examples because at the end of the day, those treaties will end up becoming norms, right, at the national level. So if you think of those, of having had the contribution from cities, in a way, cities are contributing to shape norms eventually, right? Same goes for the new urban agenda, right? What I mentioned at the beginning, the contributions from cities on the new urban agenda, at the end of the day, in some places, in some countries faster than others, but those treaties, those principles, those ideals will turn into norms. And they have the vision and the input from cities at their origins.
My name, my name is Samuel Che. I'm the Director of International Business and Global Strategy for City of Philadelphia. And you know my boss pretty well, Lawrence Schwartz. So my question is that, how do you manage city-to-city collaboration or relationship like sister city, friendship city? Is that helpful for your work, and how do you select them?
You're asking me that question, right?
My name is Charles Mayer. I'll be at the conference. Norms, I was struck by your analogies, or lack of analogies, as you said, between international law, states, and cities. And I'd like to hear from you, when do these efforts become ugly? When is actual conflictuality with larger units? It's probably within the same country. But what states have power resources vis-a-vis each other, and in what sense will cities be able to mobilize, I don't like to say force, but power resources to achieve these objectives besides just sitting around a table and advocacy? Beyond advocacy, is there a level of influence or power that you feel cities have in the international arena?
So I'll start with your question. So when I was first appointed, everybody was coming up to me about the sister city dynamic, and the reality is that many of them just get signed, and it's almost like a courtesy connection, and that again did not fit very well with the more purposeful vision that I had for this office and for the city moving forward. So we no longer engage as a sister city sort of formally. What we now do is actively pursue, well, now you guys have all heard of the voluntary local review, but we actively seek city to city MOUs, memorandas of policy. We have one with Barcelona around an affordable housing initiative. So we have limited resources and limited capacity. When we engage with another city, it is going to be with something that we have identified as purposeful, and there is a process by which we can hold each other accountable for X action. And we are no longer doing sort of what I have defined as more of a courtesy type connection, which I think is important, but I have limited resources and time, and so this is how I've chosen to shift into that.
I agree. The sister cities scheme is much more rhetorical than practical. As I said before, I engage a lot with many mayors in success stories and best practices replication, right? Without an agreement.
Exactly.
It was just a conversation.
Exactly.
I just heard about a very interesting policy project in XY city. So I asked the mayor to support me in replicating the project. And the next week I send people from my team to just learn about it, and I replicate it without anything signed. Once again, it's the cooperation spirit. Mm-hmm. And that's really, really different to what happens at the national diplomacy sphere. Yeah. And once again, that's what makes this kind of diplomacy so nice and so results-oriented.
I'm completely in the same field. So, and I'd like to address your question. Actually, again, I think that the example of migration is very telling. Not that I want to belabor the point, but of course, migration in this country is a huge issue. The national government has certain orientation, and a number of cities have a different orientation, have declared themselves sanctuary cities, including this city right here. So they took a different stance. They acted in a different way. I think they have had some impact locally, first of all. And secondly, again, these same cities were part of the movement at the United Nations in favor of a global compact on migration and refugees. So I think that this is a very good example where we see actually the power to act, I would put it this way, the power to act, and also to some extent the power of influence of cities. You know, by and large, when we can, between cities and national governments, we try to work in the same direction. It so happens that in our case, the stars are rather aligned between Montreal, Quebec, and Ottawa, but it may not always be like this. It may be different at a different point in time, and it may be the same right here in this country.
You know, it's very interesting to think about some of these descriptions. In certain senses, it sounds, you gave a definition of diplomacy, it sounds like diplomacy 101. It's relationship building. It's the expression and the pursuit of interests, and it's cooperation. But then it also sounds fundamentally different in some ways. It may be diplomacy without the threat of power, and it may be diplomacy without even a firm adherence to territoriality, to answer the question about where a city starts and where it stops. Two things, of course, the application of power and the definition of borders that have long sat as fundamental to diplomacy, and yet it is delivering action across the world. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists and in wishing Penny very good luck in the end of September.
Absolutely.
And from the Perry World House side, I want to say another huge thank you to Ian and to all of the panelists for being here today with us and tomorrow for this workshop, and to all of you for coming out today for hopefully the first of many conversations on these important issues, both here at Perry World House and with all of our wonderful partners around the world. So we will engage in some informal diplomacy over drinks and a reception
Around a
in the
glass
back.
of wine. We love that,
Exactly.
diplomats, you know.
So you're all welcome to join us, and thank you so much for coming, and please join me in thanking the panelists again.
I'm not sure I thoroughly addressed your. I'm not sure I thoroughly addressed your question and answered fully.
It was a little bit of a grenade. Somebody else had to do it. So how you doing, buddy?
Fine, thanks. And yourself?
I saw your name over
Yeah, things are fine. Things are fine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Oh, no, I think I left it open. Don't worry about it. Thank you.
Where should we give our...
I'm working on a